A quick word from today's sponsors. For all you content creators, small business owners, and entrepreneurs, did you know that creating an income online or adding a new revenue stream to your business has never been easier? Have you ever considered taking your knowledge, skills, and expertise and converting it into a course that you can sell online? Well, introducing LearnWorlds. LearnWorlds makes it easy to create, host, and sell beautiful online courses that have an impact. With LearnWorld's intuitive platform and a wealth of resources to educate yourself, you're only a few steps away from building a thriving online business in the booming knowledge economy. To find out more, visit www.trylearnworld.com/free. That's www.trylearnworld.com/free, or follow the link in the episode description to start building your course today. Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. Some of you may have noticed that there are a number of ads popping up in my episodes now, and as much as I would love to continue having an ad-free show, in order to be able to continue producing the podcast, I've had to bite the bullet and introduce a few more ads. But I do promise to try and keep it as minimal as I can. Today's episode comes with some sensitive themes of racism, homophobia, and the threat of violence, so please do continue with discretion. This episode is a wild story, so I won't give too much away or too much of an introduction, but instead I will let Kerry fill you in. So hi Kerry, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today and for coming to tell us your experiences in a movement that I hadn't heard of until we got in touch with each other. So would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
My name is Kerry Noble. I live in Texas, just outside Fort Worth, Texas. I was in a cult back in from 1977 to 1985. So long time ago now. So I'm an old man.
And this movement, I know that it had it didn't keep its original name the entire way through from the information you've sent me. But what was the name of the movement when you joined in 77?
When I first joined in 77, it was my wife and I. We had one daughter at that time. My wife was pregnant with our second child. We had some friends in this group, and in those days it was known as Zarephath Horeb Community Church, which basically meant, Zarephath means purging. It's a Hebrew word, and it's where the prophet Elijah went to be fed by some ravens, so it was a time of depending upon God. Horeb is the same as Mount Sinai, but it was where the prophet again learned the still small voice of God. So our basic name meant that this was a purging place in order to learn the still small voice of God.
Okay, so, and you joined in 77. What age were you at the point where you joined?
I was 24, almost 25.
And so did you have kind of religious affiliations before you joined this movement, or was it your group of friends that enticed you and your wife to go along and check it out?
Well, I had religious affiliations before. I'd gone to church ever since I was a kid here in Texas, grew up in the church, Baptist church. At the age of 19, I was called into the ministry. A year later, I was licensed by Southern Baptist Church, and was going to Bible school at the time when we went to visit our friends. Our friends had moved there a year before from Dallas, where we were, to be a part of that ministry over there. So when we went to visit them, have the baby, take some vacation time, and then I was going to go back. And my wife and I were both in school. We were going to finish school, still had another year to go, and then just see what God wanted us to do. But we ended up really falling in love with the place and decided to just go ahead and move on up.
And when you arrived there, what were your kind of first impressions? What did the place look like? How many people were there?
Well, it was kind of funny because it was in northern Arkansas, pretty close to the Missouri border. Very, very rural. And it took me I think that it was like 8 miles of really rocky road to get to where the community was at that point. And I had an old station wagon, so it was a little bumpy, a little rough. Uh, and when we got there, it was in an old deer resort. So there was about 7 or 8 homes in a circle, so you drive around them. And then there was a main house. And then in between the circle drive of all the houses, there was like a picnic area and that kind of stuff. But when we first drove in, it looked like an old covered wagon scene that was preparing to have a war with Indians, or something like that. It was all the cabins were white on the outside, so it was kind of funny. But once we started on the rocky road, uh, we came across a huge herd of deer, which was the first time my wife and I had ever seen deer.
Wow.
Some wild turkeys. It was the first time to see wild turkeys. And there was lakes in the area. So it was just very serene and tranquil, other than the bumpy road itself. And of course, my wife was pretty much 9 months pregnant, so I had to go kind of slow. And you know how that feeling is.
Yeah.
And, so we got there, and it was just really kind of community feel immediately because of how the cabins were laid out. So we got there. Our friends were waiting for us when we got there, and of course, it's been a year since we'd seen them, so it was nice reunion time. In those days, there was only about 8 couples, is what it was. So we were all about the same age. The leader of the group was he's 12 years older than I am. So he started the group about 3 or 4 years before this. They were out cutting timber. That's what they did. And the vision for everybody was to raise our children in a Christian environment, working together, fellowshipping together, and living on the same property. So we wanted that community feel. Most everybody had come out of the major cities, or some of them from churches, but not too many from regular churches, other than the leader of the group was Jim Ellison. He and I were the main ones that had been raised in the church. My friend, the couple that we moved up there with, they had actually come out of a cult called Children of God.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay? So they had come out a year before I met them. So they, talked a lot about their experiences. They got out when it started getting bad at Children of God. A lot of the sexual stuff that was going on. So just them sharing with me some of the experiences that they had really put a hunger in me for community. Of course, didn't want to go as extreme as Children of God did. They didn't want to either. And that couple had 2 children. My wife and I, like I said, had 1 child, and we lived together in the same house for a year before they ended up moving up there. So that year together in a 2-story house gave me a sort of my first taste of community. And we never had any issues. We fellowshiped together. The guy and me worked in the same place. So we worked together, provided, for paying the bills. And the women did their stuff. So it was just what I was really looking for. And so when we moved to Missouri, it just seemed like heaven on earth to me.
It definitely has that kind of utopian, picturesque feel about it when you describe it, kind of being away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life and the busyness of it, and having sort of like living off the land and having a small community of people. It sounds really tranquil when you describe it that way. And the big house that you mentioned, is that where Jim Ellison lived, the leader? He had the...
Actually, no. He was in one of the smaller cabins.
Okay.
He had a small RV parked next to it. My friends were actually the ones who lived in the main cabin.
Okay.
But they moved, I think it was about 4 months after I arrived, they ended up moving away.
Okay.
my wife and I ended up moving into the main settlement.
Oh, so you got the big house, the nice big house.
Yeah, so we got the big house. My friends ended up, they moved to another location to oversee a ranch for the guy that the group was cutting timber off of 5,000 acres. So our friends ended up moving over there to kind of ramrod the ranch because the owner lived in Pittsburgh. So, he wasn't there. So that, allowed my wife and I to move into the main house, which wasn't, huge compared to the cabins, but, maybe 50% bigger, not a lot bigger.
Yeah. And as people joined, did you build more cabins, or were they like kind of mobile homes that people could bring along?
Well, originally, this was called Mountain Creek Resort. Okay. That wasn't our property. The owner of that had shut down the deer lease part of it years before and just wanted somebody to live on there for free, just to make sure somebody didn't come along and destroy the place, So it was just a temporary place until the paperwork went through for the property that Jim wanted to buy, which was, a mile and a half from us. It's 224 acres. Once that purchase went through, which was early 78, then we started clearing land, building houses there. It had one old house on it, original house. But of course, everybody wanted their own houses. So then we started building. And as houses were getting built, people would move from Mountain Creek over to the Zarephath Horror community.
And how were these properties funded? Was it still kind of you going out and working and bringing back money to kind of buy supplies?
Yeah, we had agreed. When I first moved up there, the men were getting paid $100 a week for cutting timber.
Okay.
But then we agreed that, well, if we're going to, pull together and build homes for each other and be a community, then that $100 ought to let's just have a common pot.
Right.
That we could fund that, and the money would help everybody, with their basic needs and that kind of stuff. But the community would pay for the building of the homes, the power, electricity, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So did you have to put in like all your own irrigation and everything as well?
Yeah, but here's the thing: we had what we called settlements. We had 3 settlements. So you had the main settlement, on sort of in the center, and then on the other 2 ends, you had the basic settlements. Now, the basic settlements had no running water, no electricity, no insulation in the houses. Mine was the first house to get built in what we call the outlining settlements, because my wife and I really wanted to get back to sort of the basics, Part of the foundation of the group, that the reason Jim started it to begin with, it was an apocalyptic group. He believed, that Christ was coming soon, the second coming, end times, all that kind of stuff. The difference between what Jim taught and what the typical churches teach, and you've probably heard this from some of the other interviews that you've done, is most Christians believe that during this tribulation period, they would be raptured out off the earth ahead of time, right? And then you'd have God's judgment on the earth for 7 years or whatever people have. Jim did not believe we would end the rapture. He believed Christians would have to go through the tribulation as part of the purifying process.
Right.
So he wanted to prepare a refuge for people to be able to come to when all this happens. And in those days, we didn't know what would happen. There was all kinds of scenarios of what could happen: economic collapse, war with Russia, nuclear war. I mean, who knew? We didn't know. We really didn't concentrate on that too much, and we weren't setting dates for anything. We just believed at some point down the road it would happen. And so in the meantime, we would prepare for it and save, store up clothes and food and build housing to prepare for people. So the vision was apocalyptic from the start, but because we did it as a community, and I was the Bible teacher for the group once I moved up there.
Okay.
So I just taught all the Bible stuff and made sure everybody was spiritually prepared, and we just cut timber for a living. So the first 15 months was really like heaven on earth. I mean, community to me was the apex of everything that I had experienced, and it was just a delight to be there. But things change.
Yes, and we wouldn't be talking today if those changes didn't happen. So
that's right.
So it was you moved from Mountain Creek Resort. Was there a name for this new kind of settlement that Jim Ellison had purchased?
The new one was Zarephath Orb Community Church.
Right. Okay. So the entire acreage, that was the name.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
224 acres. The informal name at Mountain Creek was just Zarephath. But once we got our own property, then that sort of expanded it. So we expanded the name also. Appeal for people moving in was from a Christian point of view. Most of them didn't care about end time kind of stuff. They were like us when we first moved there. They wanted to raise their children in a country environment, Christian environment, get away from the cities, live together, work together, fellowship together, kind of thing. So, for quite a while, that was, that was the standard for us. You had to be following Jesus. We allowed no smoking, no drinking at all, no drugs, obviously. A clean lifestyle. So the standard wasn't real high, but there was a standard there before you could actually move onto the property.
And did that come with things like dressing modestly and making sure that you were kind of respectful in terms of the doctrine around sex outside of marriage and things like that?
It did, not so much as a rule. It was sort of a natural thing for us. The women just sort of naturally wore longer dresses. They weren't required to have long sleeves, or anything like that. But,
right.
Most of the women they did dress modestly. The men, when I first moved there, men had beards. It was agreed later on to shave the beards, cut our hair short. I had long hair when I first moved there because long hair represented our rebellious days before moving there. The hippie days and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So just as a symbol for being more committed, we agreed to shave the beards and cut the hair short, sort of a not buzzed necessarily, just short.
Right. Okay. And when Jim Ellison decided to start this movement, was he a part of another church or another movement, and his values didn't kind of match, so he moved somewhere where he could have those beliefs and practices?
Jim grew up in what's called the Disciples of Christ Church. I don't know if you have that in England, but it's fairly popular here. It's not one of the main denominations. Kind of a pretty strict conservative church.
Okay.
He was going to Bible college, when he was a young man, and when he became a senior at the college, he had a spiritual experience where he believed that he saw God as a whirl of bright lights at the base of his bed while he was laying down, and it changed him. It's what in the Christian circles would be known as the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And he spoke in tongues. He had just everything changed. That caused where he was a ruckus at college because the college did not believe in the gifts of the Spirit or the baptism of the Spirit. And he became pretty outspoken about his experience. So he ended up actually getting kicked out of school.
Right.
Because of it. That was in Illinois. He moved from there down to Texas, San Antonio, and joined a church that was called the School of the Ministries. And he started, as a charismatic church, charismatic movement. And there he learned more about, the gifts of the Spirit, that kind of stuff, but also more about the end time teachings. They were very strong on end time teachings. There came a point to where he believed more strongly about Christ coming back than the other elders of the church did. And they ended up kind of having a split. And that's when he left and took his family to Missouri. 3 or 4 other families in that church joined him.
Right.
By the time I got there, those other families had left, and his original wife had left also. They got tired of waiting, you know.
Okay. So that brings us then to where you are with your kind of utopian life that you've found here in this community. It must be great as well to be raising children in such an environment that you feel is peaceful and has such wonderful values. And what did education look like for the children on the commune?
Originally, Jim's children were the oldest, obviously, and he was older. So they were in public school when we first went there. After we got our own property and grew to a certain size, I think it was in 78, maybe 79, we decided to pull them out of school. Some of our children were getting old enough for school and just have our own private school. So we taught our own. Of course, you had your basic math, reading, writing, history, that kind of thing. Not so much on sciences. To be honest, Jim wasn't big on education.
Okay.
I was, some of the other people were, and I wasn't going to allow my children to not be educated in some degree. I wanted them to read, write, know how to do math, at least the basics of education. So, he said, okay. So we just started doing that. And I think there were, I taught high school kids when they got old enough. And I think we had 3 other women that taught also.
Okay. So by this point, kind of 78 to 79, how many people are actually living on the property at this point, roughly?
By mid 78, there was I think we've grown from 8 families to about 15 families.
Okay, so we're picking up some numbers and some traction. Yeah. And at what point does the vision or the ideals of the group start to change, and the kind of the peaceful community starts to morph into something a little less utopian?
That happened in August of 78.
Okay.
That was the first shift. And what happened, we had a newsletter we'd gotten from a guy up in the northeastern part of the United States that talked about what's called the 9th of Ab in the Hebrew calendar. And he predicted a lot of chaos in August. We didn't hold a lot of stock to it, to be honest, but we thought, well, who knows? This guy's supposed to be a prophet and all that kind of thing. We kind of started putting back a little bit more food and that kind of thing. Well, just in case something was going to happen, I wanted to go down to Dallas and see my parents for the last time, theoretically, if something did happen, right? While I was down there, I visited some friends that we had gone to Bible school with, and they gave me a cassette tape by a man named John Todd, who had just come through the area talking about some conspiracy theory kind of stuff.
Right.
And what Todd said, he used terminology that we had never heard about: the Illuminati, the Bilderbergers, the Council of 13, Council on Foreign Relations, those kinds of things. Stuff that meant nothing to us at the time. But he was naming names, and he was talking about how major politicians, major movie stars, rock stars, even Christian preachers were involved in witchcraft and were part of the conspiracy to form this one world, one religion government that we perceived of as part of the end times, right? So, I took the cassette tape back with me to our group, and we listened to it. The elders did. And one thing that Todd said, some of the conspiracy stuff was interesting, but the thing that he said was there are people building refuges in the United States to protect people when all this happens, the good people that are coming out, which was, of course, he was talking about groups like ours. He said, you're putting back food and you're building some homes, you're putting up clothing. But have you considered what's going to happen when bad people come out also and want what you have? How will
Right.
you protect
Okay.
yourself? So we had never thought about that. We just sort of always assumed that God would just protect us somehow. Didn't really even care about details. But Todd says you need guns. Just like Israel had to learn how to fight in the Old Testament, swords, that kind of stuff to protect against the enemies. You need to protect yourself against enemies. Well, that made sense. So we bought guns. At that point, only one guy in all of our group had a gun, and it was a single shot 22. That was it. Nobody else even owned a gun. So for the next 18 months, we spent $52,000 on guns and ammunition and military equipment. We got serious.
Wow. Oh my goodness. That's like 0 to 100 then.
Yeah. I mean, and that was in 78 to 1980. So that was a lot of money back then.
Wow.
$50,000 is a lot of money now, but it was really a lot of money back then.
How did you manage that? I mean, what were the laws like back then in terms of firearms? Was it easier to obtain things then, or did you kind of each go individually and sign your name to a firearm?
Here you can buy guns everywhere, anywhere. So we'd go to gun shows and buy guns primarily. In those days, there wasn't too much of a background check done. We'd only had the Gun Control Act of 1968 was now only 10 years old. So there wasn't that much gun control in this country.
Right. Okay.
If you were buying a gun from a gun shop owner, you filled out a form. I don't even think there was a waiting period in those days. But if you bought guns from people at gun shows, you didn't have to even fill out a form. You just bought them.
Okay.
So we bought rifles, shotguns, pistols, and of course, if you're going to buy them, you got to know how to use them. So we built a shooting range, we built an obstacle course, and we built a 4-block mock town called Silhouette City, so that we could practice every scenario we could imagine.
Wow. Okay.
So Sundays became our military day. Wednesday nights became military teaching night, to where we learned, various field craft with military. And on our military day, we just shot. Then we'd go camping out anytime that it was bad weather. If it snowed, if it rained, we'd go out hiking and go out camping, just like you would if you was in the military, and having to fight in the military.
Wow. So it was very serious, very seriously.
And we got big enough, we were growing now even more, and we got big enough to start forming squads. So we had like 4 different squads. Wow. Each of them had a specific purpose, and had a little bit of rank in there. So it got very serious. We had ended up by spring of I'd say by fall of 1980, we were known as the ¡1 civilian SWAT team in the United States.
Oh my goodness! And who was teaching everybody these skills? Were you getting kind of outsiders come in and teach you how to use all these firearms?
No, actually, the one guy who had the single shot 22 originally, he had been raised in there. He had been raised to hunt. And here's the thing: the reason he had a single shot 22 is because his dad taught him, if you can't kill something on the first shot, you don't need anything else.
Right.
So he learned how to kill a rabbit or a deer or whatever with one shot. So he was a good shot. And
wow,
this was stuff that had interested him all his life. So he had military manuals that he had absorbed since he was before his teenage years, even. So, he taught, we bought more manuals. He studied them, just like I was the Bible teacher teaching the Bible stuff. He was the military person teaching the military stuff. So, we grew. The guns, honestly, obviously this was for defense. There was no offense to talk about. Most of us had never been around guns, huge guns, all that much before. But it gave us a sense of security. Because if it did get bad and people did want to take what we had, now we were able to protect ourselves.
And where were all of these weapons kept when they weren't being used? Did you have kind of like a cache or a special room, or were they all just kept in houses?
Every man had to have a rifle and a pistol. So our rifles and pistols we kept at our house. Mm-hmm. If you wanted a shotgun also, you were issued a shotgun to keep at your house also. Some of the women wanted pistols, so, they could have pistols on them. Other than those, the rest of the armament, we had a building that they were stored in, because we made our own bullets also.
Whoa.
So that our little munition building housed, the rest of the weapons it was used to make bullets with, that kind of stuff.
So you had a full kitted armory on the property?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
We had well over 200 weapons.
And did you end up with things like grenades and other things like that?
That was the next year.
Right. Okay. So we've kind of talked about 78 to 1980 and the progression of this. And before we move on to the next year, you talked about there being different squads and each squad having a different purpose. What was your specific squad that you were a part of?
I was home guard. I was in charge of home guard because going out and fighting was honestly not my thing.
Right.
If it came down, everybody had to do guard duty at night. And when it came down from my shift at night, every horror movie I'd ever seen as a kid popped into my head. I expected, monsters to come out from behind the corners and that kind of thing. So I wasn't that much into the paramilitary part. I liked the fact that I felt safer with the weapon. And obviously, if I'm going to have a gun, I need to know how to use it. But dressing up in military gear and going out on maneuvers, that kind of stuff, that really wasn't my cup of tea. But I had to do it because we all had to do it. We all moved as one unit, so I had to do it. So, Jim had me just be in charge of home guard. And plus, there were some guys who just weren't able to go off the property. We had, as an example, we had a man who had an amputated leg right below the knee. That would have been difficult for him to have gone out. So he was part of home guard. We had a couple of guys who were mentally challenged a little bit.
Okay.
So it was better for them to be part of home guard. So home guard was I think there was 6 or 7, maybe 8 of us all together who just didn't fit the criteria for going offensive if we needed them.
Okay. And does this this 78 to 80 period coincide with when men are starting to shave their hair shorter and get rid of their facial hair as well?
Well, yeah, we started doing that before the paramilitary.
Right.
But once we got into the paramilitary, of course, then that really fit in too. And part of it, when you're out cutting timber, we cut cedar. And in the summertime, cedar, you get a lot of sap. Well, if you got long hair, you got a beard, you're going to get sap in it.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So for practical purposes, it was easier to shave, have short hair because it was easier to clean up anyway. So when the paramilitary part came in, that just fit in anyway.
Okay.
And if you're, and obviously if you got long hair, you got a beard, and you're in a fight, that's a disadvantage for you because somebody can pull your hair, pull your beard, and guide you. So, with the paramilitary part, we realized that short hair was an advantage for us.
Okay. And I'm just intrigued now because I'm starting to get visions of uniform and the property having kind of traps set up or some kind of alarm system so that if anybody's coming onto the property that you're not expecting.
We were building, like I said, we had 3 settlements, and in those 3 settlements, we were building bunkers so that if people were coming in, you could not only have to defend from your house, you could run to a bunker and defend from there. We had, later on down the road, we had landmines planted around the main settlement. So that if a huge group of people were coming in, we had I think it was 12 landmines that we could set off.
Oh my goodness.
So yeah, I mean, we got serious.
And a landmine is something you can just purchase from a gun show?
No, no, that you got to build.
Right, okay. Oh my goodness,
building landmines. One of the military manuals we bought was on how to do that.
Oh my
so
goodness.
Some of the men who are more inclined to that, not me, some of the other guys put those together, buried them. We had wires going to a communication building. We had a detonation box where you flip the switch and it would blow up that particular landmine.
That is wild.
Now here's the funny story. We had a storm. I think it was in, I don't know, 80, 81 or something. We had a really bad electrical storm one night, and lightning must have hit close to those landmines because every single one of them went off at the same time.
Oh my goodness.
In the middle of the night.
I'd start thinking that was the rapture. I'd be like, this is it. Yeah. This is it.
So it woke everybody up, of course. And we had these huge holes out, across the property where these landmines were. And we looked at that and went, maybe this wasn't a good idea. So we never replaced them at all, because then we got to realize, of course, what if this had been in the daytime and the kids were out there playing?
Not just that though, but you're all talking about being out and about and camping in the adverse weather, and then you get some crazy electrical storm where any of you could have been out on the property at that point. Oh my goodness, that's terrifying.
We could have been doing guard duty in that area at that time or blowing somebody up. I mean, it was just one of those freak things that we just hadn't even thought about the possibility of. So once that happened, we just said, no, let's not do this again. We never did.
Good. Oh my goodness, that's a relief.
We weren't always stupid, but sometimes we learned a lesson.
So, what was the next turning point with the group as it kind of carried on this journey?
Okay, two things happened in the fall of '79.
Okay.
First thing, Jim wanted to make more money for the group, and he was an iron worker by trade. And the government was building missile silos up in Missouri. And as a welder and iron worker, he could go up there and work and make really good money. He could make more money by himself than we were making as a crew timber in that week. So he was doing that. And he made plans to only come home 1, maybe 2 weekends out of the month. The rest of the time he would just be up there working.
Right.
So he was making money. And then once a month or maybe twice, he'd bring some money down for me to put in the bank, as I had the finances also. So one thing that happened during this time period, he met a man named Dan Gaiman in Missouri who had a church called the Church of Israel. And one day, Jim brought home a cassette tape from Dan's church service, and he had all the elders gathered together, and he played the cassette for us. And they started out in their music service playing patriotic songs rather than regular church songs. So they played America the Beautiful, My Country 'Tis Thee, that kind of stuff. And then some traditional hymns. And then Gaiman started talking about Christian identity, which is the racist religion of the extreme right.
Right.
And then, this was brand new for us, obviously. So Gaiman taught that the Jews were not God's chosen people in the scriptures. The white race was.
Right.
And he brought out some scriptures, that kind of stuff. Now, of course, Jim and I being raised in the churches, this was 180 degrees for us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So this wasn't as easy to grab hold onto as the guns was. It didn't fall into place right off the bat. So, but Jim was intrigued by it. And what it sort of did for us initially, because, we're a survivalist group, and then we become paramilitary based upon John Todd's recommendations, and the stuff that John Todd talked about seemed to be what or how we would have a one world, one religion government because of these secret societies throughout the world. And then here comes Gaiman, which seemed to build upon that platform even more about now, focusing more on the Jewish control of these organizations,
Okay.
or the supposed Jewish control. Okay.
So kind of more conspiracy theories coming through.
Yeah. And of course, Gaiman brought out some scriptures that Jim and I were familiar with the scriptures, but he did them in a different point of view.
Right.
What was interesting for us, I could remember, I was a teenager in the United States when the race riots were going on in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And I could remember one Sunday talking to in my Sunday school class, asking my teacher, so what does the Bible say about different races? Because I didn't know. I mean, we weren't taught that kind of stuff. And my teacher says that's one thing we don't talk about in the Southern Baptist Church, is what the Bible talks about races. Well, okay.
Why? Yeah.
So it was a taboo subject. I never knew what we taught as a Baptist about why there are different races, that kind of stuff. The only thing you sort of heard was, Ham was cursed, one of Noah's sons, and somehow became black.
Right.
And never really explained that when I was a kid, but that's sort of the idea I got. So here's a group of people with Dan Gaiman who not only were willing to talk about race in the scriptures, but wanted to talk about race.
Okay.
And that made an influence on us, because I'm the Bible teacher. I want to know if it's in the scriptures. I want to know what it's talking about, right? But it took us about 6 months to sort through that. I bought a bunch of books, read everything, because everything had to come through me first to go out to the people.
Yeah.
And then, Jim and I would study it together. So it took us about 6 months before we accepted the theology of Christian identity.
Okay.
Not completely, because part of it, are you familiar with Christian identity?
No, I'm not personally, no.
So what Christian identity teaches basically is you have Adam and Eve in the garden, right?
Right.
And you got the serpent. Mm-hmm. The serpent they call Nakash. That's the Hebrew word for the serpent.
Okay.
Who they teach was the devil, Satan. Mm-hmm. Okay? Who the temptation of Eve was that the serpent, Nakash, which was an angelic creature, seduced Eve, had sex with her. Mm-hmm. She goes and has sex after that with Adam, and she conceives twins, one from each dad.
Okay.
And who becomes Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. Mm-hmm. Right. So they teach that from the time of the garden down, there's been this warfare between the seed of the devil and the seed of Adam. That's why they call it the two seed theory. Okay, the seed line. And then, of course, after Cain killed Abel, then Adam and Eve had Seth, and that warfare continues. And they say it continues throughout today for the control of the earth. So that's why it focused more on this seed from the devil, which then eventually, they say, became known as the Jews.
Right, okay.
So you have that. But the other races, they teach that, like the black race or Asian races were created before Adam, and that they have symbolic names in the scriptures. Right. So you start looking at those things. So once you kind of sort through, which is a complicated theology, I'll admit, but if you can sort through it, then it starts to sort of make sense. Again, because it's the first time people have brought up these kinds of scriptures and sort of have a look at them from a different point of view.
Yeah.
So, that changed. By spring of 1980, we had done, accepted that. The other thing that happened in 79 while Jim was gone, some of the men started making illegal weapons. Right. They started turning our legal weapons into fully automatic machine guns, which is illegal, building silencers, hand grenades, that kind of thing.
Right.
Their philosophy while Jim was gone was, and these were some of the leaders of the paramilitary part, was that if these hordes of people come in, we need more powerful weapons to shoot up, with. Machine guns, you can, if you've got a mob coming, a machine gun would be more effective than, having to pull a trigger every time. When Jim came back, after Missouri was done, he wasn't happy with that.
No,
He
okay.
didn't like the fact that we had illegal weapons. But our paramilitary leader, the guy that trained us, explained it to Jim and made it sound good enough to Jim that Jim said, okay, makes sense. We'll keep them, but they're not ever to leave the property. We
Right.
don't need to make the government mad at us, you know. And of course, if you're going to have those things, some of the men wanted to practice with them. So we started shooting some of the machine guns. We practiced with the hand grenades, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Which of course some of the neighbors could hear.
Yes.
started complaining about it, you know. So it, but that was a huge move for us. So by the spring of 1980, we're a survivalist, paramilitary, racist organization that has illegal weapons. So we are extremist by this point.
And are these values and the weaponry classes and all of those things, are they being taught to the children and the young adults of the group as well?
Women were not allowed to shoot automatic weapons. We didn't want a concern over that. The boys never learned how to shoot guns until they were 12. They had to be 12 first.
Okay.
Once they turned 12, then they could shoot, you know, start off with a 22 and start shooting those. Nothing automatic.
Right.
For kids obviously, and the women obviously would handle the hand grenades.
Okay. Yeah.
And for the most part, most of the men never handled the hand grenades. The only time we did it was in our Silhouette City. We would do a scenario of if you're driving through town and you need to take out, say, a police car.
Yeah.
You know, but cops may be the enemy by that point. We didn't know. Then we would practice driving up to a parked car, throwing a hand grenade in, driving off.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So we would do that. It was intense, you know, training. We dug trenches. We would get down the trenches, and the guys would shoot over our heads with live ammunition, so that you could learn what it sounded like when a bullet went by.
Wow.
The training school, we had people from all across the country came and trained on our property. In fact, it was kind of ironic. The only accident we had during the training school for Silhouette City was we had a Houston police officer that came down and trained with us, who was a little cocky.
You know, right.
And the leader of the group said, you know, you need to calm down, notch it down a little bit. He said, look, I know what I'm doing. I'm trained and all that kind of stuff. Pulled his gun out of his holster real fast to kind of show off and ended up accidentally shooting himself in the foot.
No. No.
Yeah. So the only accident we had was from a cop who didn't even live on the property, you know. So
oh my goodness.
I talked to him years later. We laughed about it. I was on a radio program and he called in and said, remember me? And I said, oh yeah, I remember you.
No way. Oh my goodness. Of all the things, when he's told to calm down and he's like, no, I don't need to. And then literally shoots himself in the foot.
Shoots himself in the foot.
Oh my goodness. And that was the only accident that ever happened the entire time you were there.
Well, in terms of the paramilitary, well, in the early days, yes. We did have a couple accidents later on that I can explain later on. But in the early days during the training, that was really the only thing, which was remarkable considering.
Yeah, that sounds like a miracle in itself.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And then in 81, at some point between the spring of 1980 and 1981, there's a name change to the movement itself. Okay.
What happened? We, of course, we're getting more, just growing more, getting more people coming. We were, by this point, 150 people.
Wow, okay.
So we were like 32 families and half dozen single people.
Okay.
We had been going to some of the different other right-wing groups to visit them. Some of them would come down and visit us. And one of the groups we went to was called the Christian Patriots Defense League up in Illinois. Came real friendly with them. And they had a conference every January. They wanted us to to do the security for them in January of '81. Well, ABC News was there during this conference, interviewing people, about the survivalist movement, because that was a big thing in those days, of course. And they interviewed Jim. So, and then it was on television that night. So when we came back after that conference, Jim gathered us all together and said, look, we need a name that is going to be our public name, because when you say Zarephath Horror Community Church, everybody goes, huh? You got to explain all that, right?
But the Christian Patriots Defense League sounds a bit different.
It sounds different. So, the church name was a sacred thing for us. So we said, okay, let's try to come up with a name that would be our public name. Jim came up with CSA, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. So we had a military patch that had a flaming sword on it and a rainbow over it.
Right.
So the covenant was all the covenants God made from Adam all the way through Christ and Christians. Sword was the flaming sword, which goes back to the Garden of Eden when man was kicked out of the garden. And the arm of the Lord is who we believe would disperse the judgments of God upon the earth. So it pointed towards judgment, more than the church name did. So that's what we started calling ourselves at that point. So the church became sort of like the mother of CSA.
Right.
It was separate. We never did away with the church name, but it was just for us. But the public name became CSA, and eventually that's what everybody knew us as in those days.
Right. Okay. And the patches, were they sewn onto like loads of items of clothing, or was there a uniform established at this point?
We all wore military fatigues. We all had military outfit, the camouflage and that stuff. So it was part of the military gear that we had.
Okay.
So the patch was on our uniforms. A picture of the logo was on all the material that we published. It became our symbol. Just like, if you think of the swastika as the symbol for the Nazis, this was our symbol that everybody knew this was CSA. This was for nobody else. And most of the guys, having been from the South, liked that Jim came up with CSA because of the Confederate States of America, the old Civil War stuff. So it kind of had a heritage thing for guys who came from the South as well.
And I can't, this is so different to everything I've ever heard. This experience that you've had is so.
We were different.
Yeah, it's so different that I can't even predict where this is heading now that you've talked about building trenches and landmines and building your own grenades and having army fatigues and changing your entire doctrine to something that's
here's another part of it, because the religious part, again, the spiritual part is extremely important to us. So when we learn Christian identity also practices, and this is kind of ironic in a certain sense, they practice the three feasts of Israel: Passover, Pentecost, or first fruits, and the Feast of Tabernacles that the Jews celebrated. Passover, if you know anything about it, is when they killed the lamb, sacrificed the lamb, and it's reflective of the blood of Christ being shed on the cross. Most of the other groups just took Passover as, they had communion during Passover. We took it a step further because we always took everything a step further. And we would literally slice the neck of a lamb or a goat, like I said in the scriptures, take the blood, put it on the doorpost like they did in Egypt in those days before Moses took Israel out. We all sleep in the same house together. The first time that we did, we actually were hoping for a second time for God's, death angel to come through and kill the firstborn of everybody in the country that wasn't in a house covered with blood.
Wow. Okay.
We literally would not have been surprised had that happened. Of course, it didn't happen. We were disappointed. But every year we practiced the feast as literal as possible in
Wow.
the scriptures.
Okay. So when
Okay, so for us, this was real. This was 24/7 for us, which
Mhm.
helped. That made us even more different than everybody else, because most groups don't live together. When you're talking extremism, they'll get together on weekends, or they'll have their monthly conferences or yearly conferences. Very, very few groups live on the same property.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what made us more of a cult down the road than say a militia group or a neo-Nazi group or skinhead group and that kind of thing, or even Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
that.
I suppose as well, as time goes on and your numbers grow and you're all living together, you're kind of, even though your ideas around the theology that you're teaching and the militaristic side of it is becoming more and more severe, you're all there to bolster each other in a self-sealing system where your beliefs kind of can grow together, so there's no outside influence. So when somebody comes up with something that might seem more and more wild, actually in that group, if everybody accepts it, then it's accepted, and that's how you kind of go.
Yeah, obviously in those days there was no internet, and we had quit getting newspapers, magazines, that kind of stuff. So we had really, we had television to a little degree, but we weren't keeping up with what was going on in the world as a whole. Nothing like you do now, right? So the only material, once we got into the extremist movement, the only material we got in was from other groups. So, that just added fire or gasoline to the fire, because that, the old computer thing of garbage in, garbage out. We just kept getting more and more garbage. I'm also, in 1981, we started publishing a journal, a little newsletter, kind of 24-page journal. That was, you fold it over, staple it, all that kind of stuff. And we had 2,000 people on our mailing list.
Wow. Okay.
So, so every month we, all of us who had any kind of a position would write articles, So the guy that was in charge of our paramilitary would write a fieldcraft article. I'd write some spiritual articles, whoever else wanted to contribute, we could put that in there too, right?
Okay.
And we'd get a little bit of some factual, quote unquote, stuff from other groups we would put in, right? So for 81, after we came on to the CSA, and through 82, that was pretty much where we were. We were just putting up the newsletter and doing stuff and communicating with other groups. And then I approached Jim with, we've got all these groups across the country. It would be nice if we could all unify somehow with a national leader. And wouldn't it be great, Jim, if you were that leader, right? So he liked that.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So he said, yeah, that's a great idea. Then the other groups would come down and see CSA, meet us, we could meet them, that kind of stuff.
Wow.
So we invited the Klan, the neo-Nazis, the
Kerry.
militia people,
oh, gosh.
all these people, right? And we had in October of 1982, we had our first, what we call convocation. We had 300 people from across the country. And all these other leaders got to speak. It was a week-long conference.
Wow, okay.
We put them through the survival school. We put them through training, shooting, whatever these guys wanted to do.
Oh, so my goodness.
It was the introduction to us, right? So then towards the end of that week, we gathered all the leaders together and said, look, this is what we would like to do. Rather than have splintered groups, let's form one coalition together. And oh, yeah. And then everybody, of course, says, well, we want our leader to be the leader. No, that's not. Our leader wants to be the leader. That's our idea, right? Well, of course, nobody wanted to do that. Everybody wanted their own leader to be the leader, and every leader wanted to be the leader.
Yeah.
So obviously the national coalition thing did not appear. So
I really wonder what it would look like now if it did happen, because I feel like that's how new religious movements start. They branch off, like how you mentioned how Jim's vision at the start didn't quite match what other people were saying, so they kind of split off from each other and started their own things. So Jim's got his thing going now, and that's probably what these other groups have done that you're trying to create this kind of national coalition with. And I feel like when I read about the Seventh-day Adventists and movements like that and the Branch Davidians, that's how these groups have come to be as they are. And the Seventh-day Adventists is a huge movement now. And so it's quite scary to think about what would have happened if that would have stuck, especially with the ideals and the military side of it. I don't know, that's quite a scary thing.
But, it's so easy for groups to split, but it's almost impossible to gather them together.
Right.
Because once you split, you become autonomous. Once you're autonomous, you don't want to be controlled anymore.
No, of course.
By somebody
of course.
else, right? So it's we just never thought that it would be that difficult to do. But after, of course, everybody said no, thank you, then we realized that's difficult to do. I mean, in this country, it's like having 50 governors, governor from each state trying to agree together. It's very difficult.
Yeah, so, and probably never going to happen.
Probably never going to happen. So, we realized that was a futile thing to do, and we just never brought it up again. But here's the next step that happens. Right before the convocation, one of our elders, we didn't know this ahead of time, but one of our elders had committed adultery with one of Jim's daughters. Who was a teenager.
Dear, okay.
Yeah, and after the convocation was over, he called an elders meeting and wanted to confess in front of the elders. By that point, Jim knew about it.
Okay.
She was not happy with it, obviously. She was 14.
Oh my goodness, okay.
He's one of the elders, so, for whatever reason, he ended up sleeping with this girl several times. And he said, this is something, I'm sorry it happened, but this is something I can't live with here. I'm going to move. And,
right.
And he wasn't going to take his wife and his kids with him. They were going to stay on the property because basically, they were done as far as he was concerned.
Right.
He was leaving in shame, right? So, I mean, this was a shock to us. This was something we never imagined would have happened in our group, right? Because our kids were protected. Our kids, this was supposed to be a safe environment for our children.
Yeah.
No pedophiles to be coming in, no drugs, that kind of stuff. But to have one of our own elders.
I suppose you don't think about that at the time as well. When you're so kind of focused on protecting yourself from the outside, you don't think about what.
You don't think about the inside.
Yeah, absolutely. A quick word from our sponsors. Over at the Indie Drop-In Network, there is something special for listeners who enjoy true crime, the paranormal, and conspiracies. And that's called Scary Time. The Scary Time podcast releases a new episode each week from a different content creator, meaning you get new stories, new hosts, new themes, and diverse content all the time. One particular episode by the podcast Nopeville goes into the lore and legends of zombies, how to survive the zombie apocalypse, what could cause a zombie outbreak, and the history of zombies. Where did the idea first come from? Listen to Scary Time on Apple Podcasts today, or follow the link in the show description to find out more.
So he confessed it was agreed that he was going to leave. Well, he hadn't been gone 2 weeks. And then Jim gathers the elders together and says that God has told him to take this guy's wife as Jim's second wife.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Right? Now, polygamy was first discussed in our group in 1978. I brought it up because I saw some scriptures that kind of pointed to it. And we agreed as a group not to get into polygamy. It was taboo to even talk about it after 78. So here comes Jim 4 years later and says, God told me to do it. Well, that caused a huge split in the group. The paramilitary leader said, absolutely no, because, we agreed to this 4 years ago. We were not going to do this. And Jim says, pretty much I've got no choice. I have to do it. And the paramilitary leader said, if you do it, we're leaving. You're going to cause the destruction of CSA. Well, he ended up doing it. And we lost 2/3 of our members.
Wow.
In 3 months.
Okay.
Which, interestingly enough, the ones who left were the paramilitary people. So from my point of view, because I want us to go back to just the spiritual aspect of what we're doing. I'm picturing this as an opportunity for us to go back to just being spiritual and not the paramilitary stuff.
Yeah.
Not being involved with hate groups and that kind of thing. So I'm backing Jim on this. I'm the only elder that does. So we have the split by February 1983. Everybody that was going to leave immediately has gone.
Yeah.
Jim takes this woman as his second wife, so we have polygamy on the property. About that, shortly before that, just after that time period, another couple moved onto the property this guy had 2 wives.
Okay.
They were from another group. So once Jim did it, that sort of opened the doors. And then this other guy came in with his 2 wives. Right?
Okay.
So now we've got two polygamous families in there. This is in 83. Now, I start in March of 1983, I'm starting to change because what happened for me, I'm doing a Bible study on Matthew 24, which is, the primary chapter when you're talking about the end times and that kind of stuff, the signs of the last days. So I'm preparing to talk about, more signs of the last days and everything. And I will try not to get too theological on this, but basically there's a verse that says that except those days be shortened, even the very elect might be deceived. I had read that scripture hundreds of times before, but all of a sudden it hit me. How can the elect be deceived during the end times? That didn't make sense all of a sudden to me. And I began to look at it from a point of view of the only thing that you're deceived by is something that looks like the real thing. You can't be deceived by a $3 bill because there's no such thing as a $3 bill. So I began to kind of lay it out in steps. How would the last days deceive the elect, which we consider ourselves part of that elect, if the last days looked like the Antichrist, the opposite to the kingdom of God? Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I theorized that maybe it doesn't look like the opposite. Maybe it's supposed to look like the original. Then it brought in the parable of the wheat and tares that Jesus talked about, where you can't tell the difference until the time of the harvest. Because wheat has fruit and the tares don't, right? And so I just started putting it all together, and I became convinced that the last days, this one world, one religion government, if it even happened, would not be an antichrist situation of anti-Christians and all that kind of stuff, but would look like the kingdom of God as opposed to being opposite to the kingdom of God.
Okay.
That was revolutionary for me, right? Because what that meant for me was that I had always been taught, Jim had been taught too, most churches teach it, that man is basically evil and sinful. And were it not for the grace of God, would manifest the works of the devil, works of the flesh. I began to see it as the opposite, that man is created good and divine, and were it not for the weakness of the flesh, would manifest the kingdom of God. So my understanding of just the nature of man changed as well. So instead of seeing the end times as the worst that man could do, I began to see it as the best that man could do.
Okay.
Short of what God could do. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody that I had ever read before taught this. I'd never heard this from anything before.
Mm-hmm.
This was just, for me, this was a revelation while I'm doing this Bible study. So I present this to Jim, who, of course, threw a cow. No, I don't see it. I don't agree with it. No. He wouldn't even listen to my argument hardly.
Yeah, yeah.
He said, but I kept persisting, and he said, so what do you think we're supposed to be doing? I said, well, look at what I think God is doing. God has split the group up. We've lost our paramilitary people. We've lost that part of our identity in this thing. We're not really connected with these other racist groups, and we don't have anything really in common with neo-Nazis or skinheads or the Klan. That's not really who we are.
Yeah.
We start here as a spiritual people. Let's go back to that. And rather than being a curse to our neighbors, let's be a blessing to our neighbors. We got people who have all kinds of talents. We could open up businesses in town that would flourish our group and bless people on the outside. I said, I think that's a better mission for us.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't like it, but he said, okay. And we had been involved with the health food thing for several years by this point. So we agreed we'd open up a health food store in town. And it could become a source of revenue for us. We'd be able to get our health food stuff cheaper. So, there'd be some benefits to it. So we opened up a health food store in a Walmart shopping center in northern Arkansas. And it did quite well. But Jim just never went along with it. So after the year lease, we shut it down. And this was in.
That just doesn't make any sense to me. How can a man who says that he's had visions from God or has seen God or believes that he is supposed to take a second wife not believe you when you come to him and say, I think we should be doing better things for the community?
Yeah. And I'm the Bible teacher. I mean, it's not like I'm one of the flunkies kind of thing, right?
I mean, from what you said,
I had my arguments down.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: to do that, and I didn't get this at that time. Obviously, this later on down the road, I finally could get this. And what it really got down to, if Jim had agreed with me and done this, he would have had to have admitted that his original vision was wrong.
Right.
And if you're a leader, honestly, by this point in time, once I was able to look back, I knew that by this point in time, we were a destructive cult.
Mm-hmm.
We were doing what Jim wanted to do. That was the allegiance. We didn't question the authority and all that kind of stuff.
I suppose that's why 2/3 of the group actually left as well, because when he went against what everybody else's wishes, and went and took a second wife anyway, then where does it stop at that point? If people are unhappy with the way things are going, and it's no longer a democracy, it's obviously more of a dictatorship. If he's like, no, it's what I want to do, so I'm going to go and do it, where does it stop then? Where does he go poaching other people's wives? Or you just don't know at that point, I guess. You don't know,
because honestly, the split even really wasn't over the polygamy. That was the issue.
Mm-hmm.
The root of the split was the purpose of the elders were check and balance against Jim, so that if Jim was doing something the elders didn't agree with, we would talk about it.
Right.
Previous to the polygamy thing, if Jim had an idea and we as a group, the elders said no, he'd go, okay, and he wouldn't do it.
Right.
So this is the first time Jim says, I don't care if the elders don't agree with me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to do this anyway. So then what's the purpose of the elders?
Yeah.
Now there's no check and balance, which is what you're saying. So what could he do next?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That was really what it got down to. But here's the other thing. When we had our first convocation with all these racist groups come in, we also met a man who was from Oklahoma, who had a group in Oklahoma that was a spiritually minded group. It was the first group that we had met that was pretty close to what we were doing in the early days.
Okay.
And he was part of a countrywide ministering group of men who all of which had their own groups across the country. They were known as the Otter Creek Ministries, because every year they got together and met at Otter Creek. Jim really envied these guys because they would come in as a group, and it was like a brainstorming think tank on spiritual matters. Here's what God's doing in the heavens and all that kind of stuff, right? But here's the thing: once Jim met them, every single one of them had more than one wife. So in order to fit in with that group, Jim had to have more than one wife.
It's kind of like when he suggested the name change as well to fit in with the other groups that you'd started to kind of associate with as well.
So if it looks like CSA is falling apart, he's wanting to align more with Otter Creek theology, which most of them believed a variation of Christian identity to one way or another. They just weren't neo-Nazis or Klan or that kind of stuff. But that opened the door for him taking another wife, which of course comes from the elder taking Jim's daughter to bed. So from Jim's point of view, he saw that as God, that all this thing kind of fell into pieces. So he took this woman. So for 83, first part of 83, once he took this woman to be his wife, then I got the revelation of Matthew 24. I opened up the health food store.
Yeah.
Things really seem to be going back to the original days. We weren't doing military practices no more because we had no military leader anymore. So that kind of stuff quit. So it looked, from my point of view, that, okay, good. This is over with. We can go back to being normal to some degree or another. Well, June of 1983, there was this tax protester had a shootout with some marshals up in North Dakota, killed 2 marshals. Didn't mean anything to us. We heard about it on the news, but really it meant nothing to us. But he fled, and I think it was 2 months, a month or two later, maybe 2 months, he was discovered in Arkansas, not too far from us.
Right.
Had a shootout with FBI, and his name was Gordon Call. And he had a shootout with the FBI, and the local sheriff got killed, and Call got killed.
Okay.
So this was seen as the first time that the government really came against what the right-wing movement considered a hero in those days, because this man was a decorated Korean War soldier, big in the tax protesting movement, and gets killed. So this became our first martyr in the movement in those days. So since he was killed in Arkansas, then everybody said to us, "What are you going to do about it? This is your backyard. This is your territory," because everybody's got territories. Well, that puts us in position. Do we do something in retribution against this to save face with the movement? Or do we say, no, thank you, and we'll never be in good graces with the movement again?
Right.
So in July, it was decided that Jim would go up to Aryan Nations in the northwest of the country, Idaho, and find out what everybody else thinks should be done. And comes back and says everybody's agreed that it's time for war with the government.
Oh my goodness! Whoa.
Jim's back. So now it's going to start back up. We're going to have retribution. So, and the movement is looking on us to do it because again, this is our backyard. I don't want to do it. Jim's wanting to rebuild the army again that we've lost. So now to rebuild the army, he drops the standard. Now we're letting people back in, or letting people in who smoke, who drink, who cuss, who don't even care about Jesus. They just care about guns,
right?
And war, racism. So we have drastically changed by this point. So one of the guys that was sort of a quasi member that went between various groups in our group had a plan. He was having trouble with the IRS. He lived in Oklahoma, and he wanted to do retribution against the IRS. So he took Jim down to what was the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. This was previous to Tim McVeigh blowing it up in 95. So in 1983, we made plans to blow up that same building.
Oh my
that Tim
goodness.
McVeigh did later on. And we were going to build a rocket launcher to be bolted down in the back of a van, 12 to 16 rockets shooting at the Murrah building all at one time, right? By this point, we had a replacement for our military leader, but this guy was different. This guy had been trained in Vietnam as a munitions expert and assassination expert.
Oh my goodness.
So this puts us steps ahead now for going into bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So he's putting together this rocket launcher, and one of them accidentally goes off while he's building it.
Oh gosh.
Scars his hands pretty bad. So it was Jim and I both said, well, this because we took everything as a sign from God, to be directed by God on what to do, what not to do. So we took this as a sign of what not to do. And we determined we had to do something. If we're going to do retribution for call, it had to be more personal about call. So we decided to target the federal judge, federal prosecutor, and the FBI agent that was in charge of the case for call. Right. So we were going to assassinate them on December 26th of 1983. So we scoped out their homes, we had their addresses, everything.
What on Boxing Day? On the 26th of December, did you say? Isn't that like?
Yeah, right after Christmas.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, because we figured nobody's going to expect it. Obviously, Christmas is over with. People are still off of work, so they're, these three people will probably still be home, right? So the idea was we would drive up, knock on the door. If one of those three men answer the door, pow, they're dead. We drive off. If somebody else answers the door, pow, we go into the house. We shoot everybody else.
Oh my gosh!
The one that we're looking for. So it was bad. It was bad. It was decided that Jim, myself, one of the other elders, would be dropped off in one of the towns nearby for an alibi, because we figured CSA would be looked at, right? And three of the other men would actually go and do the assassinations. So we pack everything up on December 25th that night in two vehicles. One was a van that was a stolen van. We put all the weapons and stuff in that. The other car, and three of us were going to go in the van. Three of the men were going to go in the other car that would be, we would use on our alibi trip. Well, the town that we were going to in Arkansas was about 4 hours away. We got up on Sunday morning and it had snowed. And snow was not even predicted to happen.
Right.
So we get up there, snow on the ground. And Jim and I are looking at each other, goes, well, and this is kind of interesting. What are we going to do now? Well, it's decided we'd go on. It might take us longer to get there, but we'll go on. About halfway there.
Don't take everything as a sign and then on this day ignore the signs. Why?
I know. So, but we get there about halfway there. I mean, Arkansas is real hilly, right? So you can't drive very fast anyway. And then you got snow on top of that. And the driver, I felt like was driving a little too fast. So I told Jim, I said, this guy needs to slow down. Jim said, okay. Tells the guy to slow down. He said, oh, I got it. Older man. And it wasn't 5 minutes later. We're going around a curve, and there's another couple coming around in a pickup into our lane, and we run head on into them. So both vehicles can't go now, So we're stopped.
Is everybody okay?
Everybody's okay. I had to get out, go to the other couple, make sure they were okay, while the other guys took all the guns out of the van and put it to the car. And then the guys in the car, 4 of them left, leaving me and the driver of the car of our van still there, waiting for cops, because people drove by. I said, hey, as soon as I get, because you don't have cell phones in those days, as soon as I get to a payphone, I'll call the cops. They'll come out here. So, of course, me and the other guy, we know the van's stolen. So we're just praying that cops don't look at the VIN number, run the VIN number. So the cops get there, do their report, blame the other couple because they were in our lane. It was obvious. Didn't look at VIN numbers. and both vehicles were towed into town. By this point, Jim and the other three guys came in the car and found us. The four of the guys wanted to go on and do the mission, and Jim and I just said no. I mean, this was an obvious sign from God for us that we're not supposed to do this kind of stuff. So this is December 1983. And at that point, once the right wing movement knew we weren't going to do anything, we were pretty much written off. Now,
right.
What happened, I'll backtrack a little bit. In 1983, when we had our split, some of the paramilitary people from our group merged with some people who left Aryan nations and formed what they call the Order. Are you familiar with the Order?
No.
Okay. The Order was designed. It was a cell group of extremists who wanted to overthrow the government, and they were going to counterfeit money, rob armored cars for money. They killed a Jewish talk show host. They did a lot of bad stuff. They stole millions of dollars. Well, by 1980, the fall of 84, they started getting busted. And of course, as always happens, people started turning state's evidence. So some of our former members, we discovered, were turning state's evidence against us. So once 83 was gone, the Order's forming now. By the end of 84, this is starting to fall apart for the Order, and means we're going to probably fall apart pretty soon. So by January 1985, we start hearing things in the news and from other groups of people turning state's evidence, and we think it's pretty likely we're going to be charged with something by the government pretty soon, right? I'm concerned with, of course, Jim is, again, we're letting people come in who don't have a standard, who just want war. Jim's preparing for war. He doesn't care if the government comes in. He wants to shoot it out.
This is starting to sound like the Branch Davidians as well. Oh my goodness.
So, unknown to Jim, I had met in summer of 83. Two men came and introduced themselves to me while I was in town one day. And they were an ATF agent and a Arkansas State police officer, right? No threatening, just talking to me. Just say, we want to introduce ourselves. If you ever need someone to talk to, we'll be here. You can talk to us. Okay, fine. I don't have anything to talk about, but okay. Well, once all the other stuff started happening, and then 84, we started realizing people were turning state's evidence. In February of 85, I go to the Arkansas State police officer. And I said, look, if there's ever a warrant comes down on Jim, come tell me first. Don't let the government come in force. Because if they come in force, we will shoot it out. And you'll have a bloodbath you can't even begin to imagine.
Yeah,
you know we've been trained. You know we've got guns. Yeah, I know. I said, as far as I know, there's not a warrant on Jim. I said, but if there is, please come see me first.
Yeah.
I don't want people getting killed. He said, okay. Well, April, arrest warrant comes down on Jim. This is February, March, 2 months later. The guy comes and sees me privately. Comes to the property, says, I do have an arrest warrant for Jim on weapons charge. Will he give himself up? I go talk to Jim. Jim says, no, I'm not going to give myself up. I want to pray about it tonight. The sergeant says, you know what this means? If he doesn't surrender tomorrow, the feds are going to be here. They will surround your property. You'll have a standoff. I said, yeah, I get it. He said, Kerry, this is serious. I said, man, believe me, I get it. I know. I don't want a shootout. Believe me. Well, Jim decides he's not going to surrender the next day.
Oh my goodness.
Of course, then the day after that, we have 300 police officers from federal, state, and local surrounding our property, trying to issue a warrant on Jim. Well, by this point, we're harboring some fugitives from the Order. Now, this started on April 19th of 1985. In this country, April 19th is known as Patriots Day. It was the day that supposedly the Revolutionary War kind of started. It was also the day 8 years later that the Branch Davidian fire happened. 2 years after that, it was the day of the Oklahoma City bombing. So April 19th was significant, right? But some of those people from the order were Nazis. And April 20th is Hitler's birthday. So they really wanted to shoot it out on the 20th. And on the 20th, I didn't think I was going to be able to pull this off. I really thought we were going to end up shooting it out. So I'm going around saying goodbye to my friends in there and crying.
Oh my goodness. I can't do this.
Well, fortunately, what happened on the 19th, when I go down to see, now I'm the negotiator for the group. Jim sends me out there to find out what's going on. So instead of Army fatigues and camouflage, I put on regular civilian clothes, and I go out, walk out, because we can see snipers all around us.
Oh my gosh.
And I head out to where some of the snipers are. Got my hands up, don't shoot me. And I get, a few feet from the sniper. He says, stop right there. And I said, look, what are y'all doing? What's this all about? And he said, are you willing to go down and talk to our commander? And I said, yeah, which was down in one of our outlining settlements that I was in, it was my settlement. I said, yeah, I'll go down there, which is about a quarter mile down the road. So I can see, when I'm going down this road, I can see all of these law enforcement agents with their guns on me, and I got my hands up, please don't shoot me. And of course, what's going through my mind is, if I move wrong, I'm dead. They're just going to shoot me to death.
Yeah.
But I get down there, and I'm shaking like a leaf. And I get down there, and the head of the FBI SWAT team, which is called the Hostage Rescue Team, he was the founder. They made him the negotiator. Usually it's two different people, but he's doing both roles. And he comes up and introduces himself to me. And I really liked him right off the bat. That was good. He pulled me aside and he said, look, we're not here to shoot it out. I want you to really, really, really understand me.
Mm-hmm.
We will never fire the first shot, but I'm here to arrest your leader. But if y'all shoot the first shot, I've got a Huey helicopter over the hill. I've got a tank down the hill.
Oh my goodness.
I got a 50 caliber machine gun on top of another hill. And if y'all fire one shot, all of those will go into action, and we will level your place and kill every man, woman, and child within 30 seconds.
Yeah, all the children.
Everybody. Because we had gathered everybody from the other two settlements into the main settlement.
Right.
So if war started, there's no way to protect it.
Like sitting ducks.
In fact, we were letting the kids run wild in the yards because we figured, well, the kids are out and the women, they're not going to shoot at us, right? But he made it real clear. We do not want to kill anybody. But you start it, we're going to end it real fast.
Right.
I said, well, that's not what I want. I want this thing to end peacefully. Jim has sent me down there to stall so that the other guys can get ready for war. I'm down there, unknown to Jim, for peaceful resolution to this whole thing. Because nobody, not even my wife, knew that I had talked to this Arkansas State police officer back in February.
A quick word from one of our sponsors. By now, some of you will know that I like to recommend a treasure trove of alternative podcasts for you to listen to that are all individual and exciting, and this particular podcast is no different. Based on the Evidence is a mother and son true crime podcast. Together they discuss the heavy themes and topics that come with the territory of true crime, but they deliver their well-researched content with light humour and respect. This mum and son are relationship goals. They interact and share personal stories, all whilst bringing some compelling content. The one thing I personally enjoy about this podcast is that they cover cases that come with closure, and I love following along trying to figure out if the suspect was found guilty or innocent. So tune in today to Based on the Evidence, the mother and son true crime podcast, available on major streaming platforms, or find the link in the episode description.
So Danny Colson was the FBI guy. We got to talking, and we had some camaraderie. On the second day, like I said, I thought we were going to shoot out because of the guys that were Nazis and wanted Hitler's birthday to be the day that we did it.
Oh, yeah.
Well, then later on that evening, I'm down with Danny and we hear a shot. And of course, Danny gets on his phones immediately, finds out what's going on, and come to find out a local cop actually fired one of his pistol. Of course, I'm running back up to let everybody know that, find out one of our guys had shot, So that almost started it. But fortunately, nobody got, we didn't start anything on the second day. We made it through the second day. Now we're coming to the third day. Third day happens, and Jim wants to go down and meet Danny Colson to kind of, see what he's like, what kind of character he is.
Yeah.
So I go, and then he wants, of course, to come back up. So I go down and I tell Danny what Jim wants. He said, I can't do that. I got to arrest one. This guy comes within arm's length from me. I got to arrest him. That's what this is all about.
Mm-hmm.
I said, look, Danny, what's going to happen? He's going to come up here. He's going to talk to you for a few minutes. He's going to go right back where he is right now. What's really changed, except that now he sees who you are.
Yep.
So he thinks about it. And he said, okay, first time in FBI history that had ever been done. All right. So Jim comes down and talks to him. And of course, Jim is, he's the general. He's really got his uniform down,
Yeah.
And the profilers with the FBI had told Danny that Jim would never surrender to somebody he did not consider an equal, which was true. They got that right. So Jim comes down and Danny presented himself as almost a general of an army, because he really is.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim is very impressed. He talks to Danny for a while, and then Danny lets him go back. So Jim's impressed. Danny kept his word. I'm impressed. Huge steps for us. Then I go back up later, and Jim says, well, I want Ollie, his wife, to come down and meet Danny. So I go down to Danny, and Danny says, okay, send her down. Now, Danny's expecting your typical stereotype cult wife.
Yeah.
Cult leader wife, kind of downtrodden, beaten, feeling meek, soft-spoken, that kind of stuff. That's not his wife. Ollie was a very regal woman, very intelligent, very proper, had a presence about her.
Okay, and this is his first wife.
His first wife.
Right.
She goes down there and meets Danny. Danny is just floored by her. He admitted that she was not what he expected. And that kind of gave him more respect for Jim in that sense. So Ollie meets Danny, talks a little while, then she goes back up. So Ollie has started now trying to talk Jim into surrendering. So besides me, she's the only one. Everybody else wants to go to war. It's just Ollie and I want Jim to surrender. And we keep reiterating, this is what God has done in the past. This is what's happened. We split. We had these plans. They got spoiled. I mean, isn't it obvious that we should not be at this point in time?
Yeah.
It should be obvious. By the fourth day, Jim is starting to realize God's not going to open up the earth and swallow up the feds. People from other groups are not coming to us like they said they would to help us out. No miracles are coming. So Jim has to justify in his mind surrendering without losing face to the men. And he ends up being able to tell the men that now God has told him to surrender, that God's going to use him in a different way.
Right.
So, I go down to tell Danny that Jim's going to surrender. Danny wants all the men to come down before the women and children. He won't allow the women and children to come down first. So the men come down dressed in camouflage uniforms, military 2 lines. Jim is at the front. I'm in the back center. The men are singing one of our war songs on the way down.
Oh my
marching,
goodness.
all that kind of stuff. And I'm crying like a baby down because this is almost over and nobody's died. So all this pressure's off of me. It's coming off. The guys get down there. Colson goes up to Jim and says, "Look, I'm not going to handcuff you in front of your men because I would not want to be handcuffed in front of my men." Took us both by surprise again. Put him in one of the police cars, hauled him off, and when they got to the top of the hill and round where nobody could see him, then he got handcuffed.
Right.
They took the women and kids that we brought down later to town, put everybody up in hotels. Part of our agreement to surrender was that I would be there however long the search for illegal weapons and stuff for evidence, that I'd be there during the search.
Right.
It was mandatory for us. So for the next 4 days, I was there while they were searching the property. Of course, they found a huge amount of evidence, illegal weapons. We had C4, we had a wall rocket,
wow,
we had dynamite, silencers, we had 55-gallon barrel of cyanide.
Oh my gosh.
200 and something weapons, and they only found about 2/3 of it. I knew where the other third was, so once it was all over with, and they had let us know once Jim got arrested that any man who had any kind of leadership would be arrested the next time the grand jury met in May, so don't go nowhere. So I knew where the rest of the weapons were that were illegal. The last thing I wanted was to go through all of this again. So I approached the government. I said, look, the other guys really had nothing to do with all the gun stuff. The guys who were in the paramilitary who left in '83, they were the gun guys. I mean, Jim kept the guns, yes, but none of us really wanted the guns. Let the other guys go, and I'll plead to what's in this country is known as misprision of felony, where I knew crimes were being committed and didn't report them because I didn't have the illegal guns. I didn't want illegal guns. Well, the government said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to charge anybody who had any kind of leadership position.
Right.
Okay. So I couldn't work out a deal, but I decided to go ahead and give them the guns anyway because I did not want more trouble down the road.
Yeah.
So I turned in all the weapons, right? Jim was not happy with that. He was refused bail. He's in jail. It's 40 days after he's got arrested that now me and the other guys get arrested.
Okay.
So he's had 40 days in jail by himself. He's in solitary confinement. I get arrested, and part of the plea bargain agreement for us to surrender was if I get arrested, I get to be in the same cell as Jim. So they work together. They agreed to that. So they put us in the same cell. The next step was revolutionary for me because Jim never said, how are you doing? How's everybody else? What's going on? Nothing.
Yeah.
First thing he did when I get there, he gives me this list. He says, look, I'm cooperating with the government to bring down the other leaders of the right-wing movement. And I've written a bunch of notes of people I've met when and what was talked about. And I need for you to collaborate everything. So here's the guy who said if we ever surrendered or ran from the government, he'd shoot us in the back, has been in jail now for 40 days and has already started working out a deal to turn evidence against the other leaders. So now this is what he believes God really wants him to do. And he says, you were right all along. I was wrong. So let's do this. So I look at the list, at least half of it was just lies. And the other half, I said, yeah, Jim, I recognize the dates and the people. I said, I wasn't here. This is stuff you told me about, but I wasn't there for hardly any of this stuff, right? I said, I'm not going to be any good at that. He said, just believe me, the government wants this to happen. Right? So Jim, in the meantime, they put more charges on him. He goes to trial for racketeering. He's found guilty, gets a 20-year sentence.
Right.
By cooperating, he could get his sentence reduced. But it's going to be, that was in end of May, I got arrested. So in June, we're doing this. By July, the government has already offered me a deal that if you'll turn state's evidence against Jim, you won't do prison time. Chances are we'll just drop the charges if you'll move back to Texas.
Right.
And I said, no, I won't testify against Jim. I'm not going to do that. Jim's done more for me than anybody on this planet, in spite of all the bad stuff.
Yeah.
I can't do it. I'll move back to Texas, but I'm not going to testify. They said, okay, you don't have to testify, but and we won't argue probation if you'll plead guilty to conspiracy to possess unregistered weapons, which was a 5-year max. Now I was had 21 charges, was facing 210 years if they stacked one on top of each other, which they rarely do.
Say that again. Charges against you personally, 210 years? 210
years for me.
My goodness.
They charged me with actually possessing 21 different illegal weapons, none of which I ever possessed, because I didn't want them. I never had a illegal automatic machine gun in my house. Never. Only shot one time, and didn't like it. But they were going to charge me.
Right.
Because I'm number 2 guy, right?
Yeah.
So they offered me a plea bargain. If you'll plead down to conspiracy, it's got a 5-year max. I knew I was facing, if I went to trial, I'd get the maximum just like Jim did with racketeering, and I'd get 10 years. They wouldn't stack them. They would just put them all together.
Yeah.
And I'd get 10 years.
Right.
I don't want to spend 10 years in prison.
No.
By this point, I'm tired. I don't want to be in the movement any longer. I just want out of I want the nightmare over with.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, I'll take the 5 years. So I go back and I tell Jim and the other guys that I'm taking a plea bargain. Well, Jim and I are in what they call an exercise room by ourselves. And I tell him, he said, look, here's what I want you to do. I want you to tell the government that in all these years, you were the power behind the throne, that you had something on me and you were blackmailing me for this. And even though I was the front person, you really had all the power.
What?
So that I can go back to the farm and keep CSA going. I said, not a way in the world. Now this, can't even tell you, Casey, how hard this hit me. Here's a man that I pretty much idolized, thought was, for quite a bit of time, thought was perfect as a man of God on this earth. Telling me now to lie to the government so that I take the blame, I go to prison so that he can go back and keep the group together. I said, I'm not doing that. I said, first of all, it's not true. I would never do it. Second of all, the government would never believe it. And third of all, I can't even believe you're asking me to do this.
Yeah, and not just that, so that he can go back to the farm and run it how? With guns and wives
he'd have to start all over from scratch, doing the whole thing. So, and I said, no, I can't do it. So he looks at me and says, so you're going to betray me. And I was so stunned, Casey, that I had to turn away and look at the window and cry. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, betray you? I could have already betrayed you.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was just thinking. That if I wanted to betray you,
yeah, I could testify that you were an accessory to murder. And you would spend the rest of your life in prison. I got stuff on you nobody else has. So, betray you? No, I'm not betraying you. You're betraying me. And it woke me up to the kind of man that he had now become. The cult leader exposed. And of course, now we're on the outs even more. So.
Oh my goodness, that must just,
It was horrible. It was horrible. it was the lowest I had ever been in my life at that point. I'm separated from my wife and my kids. I don't get bail. I'm there without bail, so I can't get out. It's still another 2 months before sentencing that I got to wait with this guy.
Yeah.
And it was just, I hated it. But we went to the sentencing. The government agreed not to argue probation. I was hoping, first offense. I helped on the negotiations. I turned all the rest of the guns over. I mean, I did, in my point of view, I went far beyond what it would take for some leniency in this. So I was really hoping I was willing to go back to Texas, But I walked in there and I knew right off the bat I was not going to leave and go home that day. I knew I was going to get sentenced. And I got 5-year sentence, the maximum. So I was, taken to jail, then taken to prison.
Oh my goodness!
26 months in prison.
Kerry, what a wild thing you've just told me. Like, and the listeners can't see, but I've spent most of your story like watching the screen through my fingers, because I just could not comprehend the direction that things were going in. And how long of a sentence did Jim end up serving?
Did Jim get?
Yeah, how long of a sentence did Jim actually end up serving?
He got a 20-year sentence originally, then he got a 10-year sentence on weapons. Once he turned state's evidence and agreed to testify, they had what they called a sedition trial in 1988 against the leaders of the right-wing movement.
Right.
He did testify against them, and it was agreed no matter what the outcome, he'd get his sentence reduced in half. So it was reduced to a 10-year sentence, and he did almost 9 years.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in your emails to me that the CSA disbanded in 86 because most of the men were arrested. The women couldn't.
The men were all gone. There was just the women that were being helped by some neighbors and other groups that we had met. But once they couldn't pay the payments on the property, the utilities, that kind of stuff, women just said, we got to leave, and they abandoned the property sometime in 86.
And what was prison like for you? I mean, what kind of other inmates were you around? People of similar kind of sentences or completely different? Were people like fascinated by your story?
Oh, I didn't tell my story in prison.
Right. Okay.
No, you don't do that. You'll never hear somebody's story in prison. Not federal prison. You may stay, but people pretty much keep to themselves. So I'm federal. I'm not state when I get arrested. Obviously, I've never been in jail a day in my life, so I don't know what to expect. But I'm a big movie fan in those days. I've seen hundreds and hundreds of movies. So first day jail was bad enough. The first day in prison, everybody seemed like they were 10 feet tall, and I'm going between these two rows of convicts in there. And it was scary. It was scary. I'll admit it. This was not where I wanted to be. But when you first go into federal, you're designated by the category of crime that you do. So you have minimum, medium, and maximum prisons in the federal system. So I was classified a minimum, medium,
right,
between the first two, right? So I had to start out with a medium, knowing that over time, if I behaved, I'd go to a minimum security, right? So I'm in with people who have not necessarily similar types of crimes, but similar sentences. Non-violent, a lot of drugs, of course, those kind of people. Bank robbers, I was in with some politicians, that kind of thing. But nobody violent. I was considered non-violent. So I was in, medium to start off with. After a few months there, then I was taken to minimum, which they called a camp. No fences. You could wear your own clothes instead of prison clothes, that kind of thing. So, it started getting nice. I got to the point where I could have a furlough with my wife and kids. So that got okay. And then FBI came to see me and told me that Jim was going to testify against the movement, and they wanted me to testify also. I said, no, thank you. I'm doing my time. I want to forget everything going on with my life. And they said, you don't understand. If you don't do this, then you're going to get charged as part of the right-wing movement, and you could be facing life in prison like some of those guys are. I said, you're right. I didn't understand. But now I understand. So I don't have too much of a choice. So I had to end up testifying at the sedition trial also. Wasn't very good at my testimony because I didn't know too awful much as far as what went on with the other people that Jim knew about. By the time the sedition trial had come, I was already out of prison. I already served time, got out a little early because I was cooperating with the government. So I'd already been out for about 6 or 7 months by this point. Jim got his sentence reduced in half, and life kind of went on. I was a little scared of retribution against me for testifying, but never had any threats against me or my family. Came back, had come back to society, had already had a job, and so life just kind of went on. I had to try to straighten out everything. It took me, I started turning around in '83, and it took me till 1992 to sort stuff out in my head, especially the theology stuff. That was hard. I had to put my Bible down for a couple of years because I couldn't read scriptures without thinking of it from a Christian identity point of view or racist point of view. So it took me a while to get that part out of my system. I started speaking out against hate and violence in 1990. 95, of course, we had the Oklahoma City bombing. Shortly after that, 3 years after that, I wrote my first book, explaining the whole thing about what the right-wing movement is all about. I'm doing public speaking stuff at law enforcement conferences, human rights conferences, civil rights, that kind of thing, to help people understand, the theology and philosophy and mentality of right-wing people. When I came out, there was only, I think there was 4 of us in those days who had gotten out of the movement that were speaking out. So we were very few, and nobody had experienced what I had. Nobody had been in the armed standoff or, community, done any kind of dangerous plots like we had done. So I was unique in that. So I got invited to a lot of terrorist conferences to talk about how dangerous the right-wing movement can be.
And you've written a second book since your first book as well.
I wrote a second book, 2008, 10 years later, that told the same story in a shorter version, but I did a lot of here's what I learned at this particular step.
Yeah,
here's what's happened. Now looking back years later, this is what I see as what God was doing and how I learned from that experience. So that my point of the second one was, if you've done something, made a major mistake in your life, you think God is forsaking you, or you think you'll never recover, read my story and the lessons I learned and how you can apply that to your life.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like a good resource potentially for people who have been caught up in their own high controlling groups.
Yeah.
So would you just like to let the listeners know what the name of those 2 books are and where they can find them?
The first book is called Tabernacle of Hate, Seduction into Right-Wing Extremism. It's available on Amazon. It's published by Syracuse University Press. They did a marvelous, marvelous job on it. And it's got, it was updated from the first edition. And plus I added 2 booklets, propaganda booklets that I wrote in CSA days that kind of explain more of the background and stuff. So it's a very good educational source as well. Second book is called Tabernacle of Hope, Bridging Your Darkened Past Toward a Brighter Future. That one I self-publish. It's available through me. If they'll go to my Facebook page is under Noble Consulting on Facebook.
Yep.
Then they can find the information there and how
Yep.
to contact me and that kind of stuff.
I'll also post a link into the episode description to the Amazon book and the self-published book and the Facebook page as well, for anybody that'd be interested in finding out more. And one thing I found was really interesting, which I think I mentioned to you in my emails, that when I Googled your name just to see what would come up, it was a headline from a Stephen Hassan article on his website, Freedom of Mind, that says Kerry Noble, former leader in one of the first American white supremacy survivalist cults. So when I read that title on a cult expert's website, I was thinking, who is this person I'm going to speak to, and what on earth is their story going to sound like? And I just am in absolute awe of the journey that you've been on. And
it's a little unique.
It's definitely unique, but I think it feels like you've come full circle. I mean, What would you say to yourself now if you could speak to your 24-year-old self who's just rocking up to this commune?
I would tell my 24-year-old self, stick around for a year, maybe 15 months, and get out.
Take those experiences and apply them somewhere else.
Take that first year where it was really good, and then get out of there. Part of what I had to reconcile within myself was anytime that you've gone through this, and you know this talking to other cult people, you get to the point where you have to accept personal responsibility for it.
Absolutely, yeah.
A lot of the steps that we took because of me, not more me sometimes than Jim even. I brought the John Todd tape. I could have listened to the John Todd tape and thrown it away. And Jim had never heard it, and we might not have ever bought a single gun, right? Jim brought us the cassette tape on Christian identity, and it was up to me to study it to see its validity. And I could have said, no, this is false doctrine. Yeah. Rubbish. And I didn't do it because I became a yes man for Jim. I could have said no to the polygamy thing and tried to dissuade him from it. So many times I could have stood up and just said, Jim, this is wrong. I could have pushed further in 83 when I got the revelation of the goodness of man instead of the evilness of man. But I was still intimidated by Jim. I was still afraid that I was missing God if I turned against Jim.
Yeah.
And that was a serious thing for me. You know that from any kind of cult experiences people go through, they have to face that. So owning up to my responsibility that a lot of this was my fault was hard to do. And so once I got to that point.
Is that kind of what you meant when you said that you had to take, kind of a few years up until sort of 92 to reflect on all of that and come to some type of realization within yourself? I mean, how have you come on a journey? Have you managed to forgive yourself?
I was finally able to. That took a while. You know that from cult people. What happened for me was, when I got out in 90 and I started speaking out, or got out of prison in 90, I started speaking out. Every time I spoke, of course, that helps in the healing process. Then I start writing the book. That helps in the healing process. I also joined an organization called Toastmasters International. Are you familiar with them?
No.
Okay, Toastmasters is a public speaking organization.
Right.
Where you learn to get in front of people and speak professionally. I didn't have any trouble speaking in front of people. I've been doing that for years and years. But so you're not critiqued on what you talk about, the content. You're critiqued on how well you speak. If you do too many ahs and ums and that kind of stuff, right? That's what you're critiqued on. So I was in Toastmasters for 10 years. In those 10 years, 90% of my speeches were about CSA days. So it gave me, years later, I told the group that they were my psychological savior because it gave me a chance to talk about stuff with no judgment
from
people. Right. There was a Jewish man in our in our local club that him and I became real good friends. I had opened up to the ADL in those days, was in touch with the local ADL office. They helped me to understand some Jewish aspects of stuff. I'd gone to a synagogue meeting. I studied Hebrew under a rabbi. So there were a lot of things that kind of helped me in my healing from outsiders along the way. And I did forget, I know we've been on here for a long time, because I didn't tell you how bad I got on the phone. Which I don't know if do you know about the gay church bombing?
I don't know. Over here we hear a lot about all types of, right.
And I should have said this earlier. I'll put out there pretty quick for you. In 1984, I told you, this is after the health food store shut down.
Okay.
We had Jim and I were arguing a lot over polygamy issues, and it wore me down. I wanted to leave the group by that point, but my wife didn't want to leave at that point. So I said, okay, we'll stick around. So Jim and I were at such odds. There's a thing that's common with a lot of cults. We called it earning your place in the kingdom. I don't know what other cults may call it, but it's a similar kind of thing.
Okay.
You earn a position in the kingdom of God, right? And I believe that I had to appease myself with Jim in order to maintain my position in the kingdom of God.
Okay.
So I volunteered for a mission. We had heard a news report on the news of a park in Kansas City, Missouri that had become a gay park.
Right.
And on weekends, especially Saturday nights, gays would go there and meet. So I said, have our munitions guy get me a silenced weapon.
Oh gosh.
I'll go up to this. Now this is the scariest part of the journey, so be prepared. That I'll go up there and I'll circle this park. I'll take one of the guys in our group, which is from Kansas City, so he went with me because he knew his way around. I'd never been. I said, I'll go around this park and I'll shoot who's ever in the park.
Oh, Kerry! Oh my gosh!
And then, and I had him build me a briefcase bomb with C4 in it, military explosives, and I would take it to a large adult bookstore, and I'd blow up the bookstore, right? Because Jim, obviously, homosexuals in those days we considered, the epitome of anti-God, and we considered the pornography industry as anti-God. So these would be two symbols to the other groups across the country. So the guy and I leave on Saturday evening it's about a 4-hour drive to Kansas City. We get at the park around 10 o'clock, between 10 and 11. And we drove around that park half dozen times. Never saw anybody. And he's driving. I've got the window down. I've got the gun. All I got to do is see somebody and shoot. That's it. But nobody'd even hear it. The silencer was very quiet.
Oh my gosh.
But nobody, right?
Thank goodness.
So I said, okay, so let's find an adult bookstore and we'll do the bomb thing there. So we found a pretty good sized adult bookstore finally. I tell him to stay in the car. I'll take the briefcase in, go to the back somewhere, set the timer, walk out. 5 minutes later, boom. So I walk into this adult bookstore. The clerk behind the desk says, come on in, but you can't take the briefcase in with you. Oh, okay. That makes sense, because obviously if I'm taking a briefcase, they think I might try to steal some magazines or adult videos or whatever.
Right.
So he says, you can leave it with me and then pick it up when you come back. And I said, well, I don't want to do that. I'll just take it back out to the car and then I'll come back in. So I take it back out to the car and don't know what to do now, because obviously I don't want to go back in there with the bomb. So we stay Saturday night. We get up Sunday. He says, well, let me take you where I grew up at church. It's okay. So we drove up to this church. I said, are you sure? He said, yeah. I said, well, it's not your church no more, man. It's a Metropolitan Community Church, which was the gay church in America in those days, the #1 gay church. said, your church is full of homosexuals. So we looked at each other and said, maybe this is what God wants us to do.
Oh,
right?
gosh. Oh, this is awful.
So you thought the story was bad before.
Oh,
So we walk in there with the briefcase. I'm carrying the briefcase. Of course, they think we're just two gay guys coming in there. Now, we don't know what to expect. Obviously, neither one of us has been in a gay church. We're the stereotype that we've always sort of been programmed with over the last few years is sexual orgy and all that kind of stuff. We walk in there, and it's different in the sense that the women are on one side and the men are on a different side of the aisle. But that's pretty much, and there's some hand holding, arm around shoulders, that kind of stuff, but nothing major. The pastor comes out, starts talking about announcements, talks about his sexual relationships with the music director. Of course, there's no such thing as gay marriage in those days in the United States. So this is more and more looking like what we're supposed to do.
Oh.
I've got the briefcase under the pew. All I got to do is just barely open it, flip the switch, we leave. 50, 60 people. This would have been the largest domestic terrorism act in United States history. I was this close.
Oh,
right?
I can't.
So one thing that you're taught military-wise is never put a face on the enemy. You have to dehumanize the enemy, which we have been doing with stereotypes and everything for several years. I'd never been around homosexuals at all in my life. Never been around a Jewish man or woman in my life. So stereotypes were a little bit easier for them. I'd been around blacks. That was a bigger issue for me because I had black friends before I ever moved to Arkansas. But I'm sitting here, and it's hard not to put a face on the enemy because I'm sitting right there looking at the enemy.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting realizing, first of all, these people look no different than I do.
No. And when you say you've never been around a homosexual before, like, how do you know, really?
How do you know? Unless they tell you or try to accost you or something, how would you know? So I'm looking around, and they're just people. Nobody, looks out of the ordinary, right? So then I take the next step and I start thinking about these people have never hurt me. They've never hurt my family, my friends. They've never done anything to me.
Oh my gosh.
And here I am sitting just seconds apart from killing people who, as far as I know, have never even hurt anybody, right? And then the next step I take is looking at the consequences, which obviously you're not supposed to do. And in the cults, you have a cult mentality. There's a certain point in time where you quit thinking logically.
Yeah.
And until you can get the cobwebs out and you can start thinking again. So you don't think in terms of consequences, or ramifications of your actions for down the road. You just don't do that after a certain point in time. So for the first time in probably 3 years or more, I'm sitting there starting to question the consequences. What will happen if I do this?
Yeah.
Is the other group's going to really rise up and follow suit? We have war in this country. Or is it more likely that I will do this and then I will either get arrested and spend the rest of my life in prison, go to death row, or shoot it out in some sort of a shootout with the cops down the road? Neither of which obviously appealed to me.
No. And
then, Casey, the fourth step happened. And this is what changed everything for me. The music started. Music, of course, is an integral part of our church service, just like it is everywhere, right? And the church music starts, and I'm watching these people, and they start doing things that I do and that we did in our church services. Close the eyes, lift the hands up, start praising God, And it hit me all of a sudden that these people are no different than I am.
No.
They're trying to find their place. Excuse me for saying this part hits me sometimes. They're just trying to find their place in God.
Mm-hmm.
Just like I was trying to find my place again in God. So now I'm identifying with them.
Yep.
Ceased to become homosexuals. Now they're me. Now they're Christians. And the scripture that came to my mind was, draw nigh to God and God draws nigh to you.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say unless you're a homosexual. It doesn't say unless you're black or Jewish. Nothing. You draw nigh to God, God draws near to you. Period. That's the promise.
Yep.
So I'm looking at these homosexuals who have now ceased to be homosexuals. And I know in my heart that as they're calling out to God, God is drawing near to them. And I can't kill Christians. So I pick up the briefcase and I tell my friend, we're leaving. So we leave. I get out to the car, explain to him what I believe happened to me. And he said, good, because I didn't think we were supposed to do this either. So he had changed.
Oh my goodness! And those people will never know what
they never knew.
Oh my!
Never.
Oh my!
Now they knew. They found out years later, but they never knew at that point.
That's terrifying.
And then we drive back to CSA. Jim and the other men are watching TV because for all night and all day they've been waiting for some news report of what has happened. I walk in, left the briefcase out in the vehicle because I didn't want to carry it to Jim's house. Jim says, what's going on? And I explain it to him. And Jim looks at me in front of all the men and just says, you're a coward.
Oh, gosh. I really don't like this Jim character. This Jim guy is not a good guy.
And I just took it. And at that point, I'm ready to go. The whole way back to CSA, I'm praying to God, I can't do this no more. I'm leaving. I'm taking my wife and my kids, and we're gone. And I believe that I heard the Lord talk to me and just say, you can't go. You have to stay. And I was not happy with it. And I prayed about it all the time. I want to go. I want to go. You can't go. You can't go. So Jim and I are now arguing constantly. I'm trying to get the group to go back to the way we used to. Jim and I are butting heads. This was in '84. Shortly after that is when I met the ATF agent and the sergeant of the Arkansas State Police.
Yeah.
And then I realized, of course, once we had the siege, the reason I couldn't leave was because there would have never been a negotiator, and Jim and guys would have shut it out. They would have, because I wouldn't have been there to prevent it. So, I had to end up going to prison for something I didn't do in order to save lives, which was fine.
Do you feel like that time that you spent in prison is kind of like a sentencing for your involvement in things like bringing the tape to the group in the first place, for not standing up against the polygamy and things like that?
Yeah, I think it was a huge part of for not standing up like I should have stood up. Because whatever we do, whatever we sow, we reap it some way or another.
So even though you didn't own the weapons or kind of have much to do with the weaponry itself, you were complicit in the other things that were happening within the group. So it's almost like that's what you served your sentence for. Yeah.
No, honestly, I went to prison for something I didn't do, which was the guns. But there were stuff I did that they didn't know about. But the government never knew ahead of time about the Murrah building plans or the assassination on the judge.
Absolutely. Oh gosh.
They didn't know about that when we got arrested. They found out about that later.
And conspiracy to commit murder, I suppose, is many more years than 10-year sentence.
Yeah. By the time they found out about it, part of my plea bargaining agreement was I would never be charged for anything previous to my plea bargain.
Right.
The only charge I would have was conspiracy to possess unregistered weapons. If the government ever found out about anything else, I would not be charged. So years later, once I'd served all my time and I'd gotten out and I had done the sedition trial, then I was able to publicly let the authorities know what happened. I started talking about it when I did the terrorism conferences
Yeah.
and that kind of thing, to let them understand how close somebody like me could get. Because part of the main reason for writing the first book is, how does your average guy at point A get to point Z?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I was a pacifist. My mom raised me anti-violence, anti-racism, anti-gun. And to get from that childhood to 1984, where I almost committed the largest domestic terror act in this country at that point, how do you get to that point? That was part of the purpose of the first book, the main purpose, besides, you know, my healing and the thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So, to be honest, it was a struggle. It was a struggle for me to own up to everything and to sort of forgive the prison time, to see it as a healing time for me, to forgive myself, to forgive Jim eventually. Those took a lot of years. It took all the way till 2004,
right,
before I could forgive Jim.
And what about your faith? Where does that stand now?
Stronger than ever. You know, it's a funny thing. I never lost my faith. It just got better and better. Because I was already looking, by the time of the siege, I was looking back and knowing and believing where God tried to stop us.
Yeah.
Tried to get us to go back. So I understood the signs. I understood the grace of God in it. And I understood that certain point that you sort of cross the line, and it's not that grace is too late, but that you sort of miss the opening kind of thing. And I knew that it was good for me. I spent 3 months in solitary confinement in prison, in a cell, completely by myself. I could get out 3 times a week for an hour, and that was it. The rest of the time I'm in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement broke me. The only thing that saved me through solitary confinement was I could call my wife every day. And there was one day I talked to her. My wife was not having a good time with the kids. She was having a lot of trouble. We have 6 children.
Wow.
So she was having a hard day. And I got off the phone and I just screamed at God. I cussed at God. You know, and just, you know, F this and F that. And I fell to pieces. And I fell down to the floor and just wept. And you know, are you familiar with the term? I think it's called dark night of the soul. That was my dark night of the soul. That was my stripping of all my pride. You know?
But I suppose you had to get to that point to be able to rebuild to where you are today.
You do. You have to get to that point at some point in time. That was mine. And once I got to that point, I did a little bit longer, you know, till the solitary confinement was over. I still did another 4 months in prison in the outside before I got to come home.
Yeah.
But it was easier. You know, I was ready to get home. I had to rebuild my family, of course. My 2 younger children didn't hardly remember me. So I had to rebuild my relationship with them and the older children, and prove that I wasn't the same guy that they had come to know, you know.
And what does your relationship look like now with your wife and children?
Oh, it's great. We have a great family.
Yeah.
My wife and I have been married for 48 years in September. 6 kids are grown, of course. We got 8 grandchildren with another one on the way. We're a very, very tight family. I will let you know this. Another part of my uniqueness in this whole story. When I came home from prison, I set my kids down. My oldest one was 10 when we got busted. So she's 12 years old now when I get home, almost 13. So I set them all down and I said, look, y'all, mom's told you something about my past. You know, I was in prison, obviously. And I filled in some of the blanks that they didn't know about. I said, I am here to tell you, I don't care if your friend, what color they are. I don't care what church they go to. I don't care if they believe in God or not. None of that is important to me. If they're your friend, they're welcome over here. I want you to understand that from from the beginning. I will never turn away any of your friends, no matter what. Now, I will tell you this. I expect you to have more of an influence on those children, on your friends, than your friends have on you. Because I know how I'm raising you. I don't know how they're getting raised. So I do expect you to be a better influence. And now my kids are grown, married. I've got 2 sons and 4 daughters. My oldest daughter married a white guy. My older son married a white woman. They're bikers. Tattoos all over. I hate tattoos with a passion, right? But he's my biker son. He's sort of my alter ego from when I was a kid.
Right. Yeah.
My third child's a daughter. She's married to an African American man that I just love with all my heart. I have a African American grandson with me. I've got my next one is a daughter. She married a half Hispanic, half Native American guy.
Okay.
So I've got 3 grandchildren with them. So both of those heritages are there. My next one's a son. He's married to a woman from Kenya, black woman. Got a black grandson with him. And my youngest one has got a daughter married to a white guy. But so I've got some diversity in my family.
Absolutely, yeah.
When I used to speak at conferences before my younger 2 got married, I'd tell them the story, and I'd say, I'm pretty much expecting my younger son to marry an Asian girl, and my daughter tell me she's lesbian, and then I've got a whole rainbow coalition in my house, all at one time. So, it's kind of, it's turned out good for that. Danny Colson that I told you about before, him and I became friends in '95. He's the FBI agent that was in charge of the operation. Him and I have become extremely good friends. Jack Knox, who was the FBI agent that we targeted in '83.
Yeah.
When the siege happened, he wanted all the women arrested on charges also. Prosecuting attorney that we had targeted said, no, I'm not charging women. That would be politically suicide for me.
Right. Yeah.
Jack Knox ended up befriending so many of the women and the men from our group, helping the women to move away from the farm, to helping men when some of the guys got real short sentences. So when they got out, he'd help them, got reestablished. It became so emotional for him, he had to retire from the FBI.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I can kind of get that.
So there was a lot of ironic stuff. The ATF agent I met in '84, him and I are good friends today, have been for a long time. Things that, like you were talking about, the full circle thing.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Things have really turned full circle, all of that helped in my healing, to where I could forgive myself, trust myself again, and my faith is just better than ever.
So you still have
I'm extremely grateful.
Yeah, absolutely. You still have a strong connection to God, but you've also managed to take accountability for everything that you were a part of during your time in the movement. Wow, that is, Kerry, I've never heard anything like that in my entire life, what you've just told me there. That is like something you read in a fiction book. And that's your lived experience.
Well, you can read it in a nonfiction book. I wrote one.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate that for the listeners. Tabernacle of Hate, Seduction into Right-Wing Extremism is available on Amazon, and the self-published Tabernacle of Hope, Bridging Your Darkened Past Towards a Brighter Future is something that I will link to in the show description for anybody that would be interested in reading further. We've been speaking for nearly 3 hours, but I imagine there's such a wealth of information that's included in especially the first book that we haven't managed to go over today.
Yeah.
So probably definitely still worth a read for anybody who kind of wants to know a bit more. I just can't.
And the second book is good for people who've come out of cults also, who've come out of bad situations. It's a good book for them to sort of understand some steps that they can take to be able to forgive themselves, because it's difficult when you come out of groups like this.
Yeah.
To
I
learn
think
to trust yourself again.
The second book sounds particularly prevalent, or particularly relevant for members of groups who have potentially proselytized and brought people into a movement that's been highly controlling, and then leaving the movement and still having those people that you've brought in involved in a movement that you then consider like highly coercive or manipulative or a cult, and then you move away from the movement and still have that. But I brought people into this and they're still in it, and that's my responsibility, and that's almost my fault that they're there. So that second book sounds like a really good piece of reading material for people that might be struggling with those kinds of thoughts and feelings.
Right.
But I can't thank you enough, Kerry, for coming and telling me your story. There are so many things in that we've gone through, that we've explored, that a lot of people would never own up to and never admit to. So I can't imagine how much you must have had to speak about this, and how much work you have to have done on yourself to be able to come here and just say, like, I sat in a church once with a homemade bomb. That is just so wild to me. But I think it's kind of commendable that you can come and speak so openly about those experiences that you've had. I mean, I guess my last question to you before I ask you if there's anything you think we've missed is, are you still in touch with Jim, or when was the last time you spoke to him?
Jim passed away. It was March 27th, so a couple of weeks back. Almost.
Right. Oh, okay.
The last time I talked to Jim was in 2007. My wife and I were meeting a couple, three other couples from our old days. We didn't invite Jim. Jim found out about it and kind of crashed the party.
Right.
For a day.
Okay.
Didn't stay the whole time. And I told Jim at that meeting in 2000, that was 2007, that I had forgiven him. My wife said she forgave him. It was the only time that he ever apologized to any of us.
Right.
Sorry
Okay.
for what happened.
Wow.
And then I saw him again in 2016 when one of our core members passed away, and there was a memorial for him. A lot of us from the group went to that memorial. Jim was there. By that point, Jim was already in a wheelchair. He was getting arthritis real bad. He'd broken a hip. So, and he was up in age. It was a 2016, so 5 years ago. So he was 75 then. And then he got, first part of this year, he was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, was put into hospice, and then he passed away in March.
And how did that make you feel when you found out that he'd passed away?
Part of it was, Jim was not in a good physical place.
No.
He already had dementia. He didn't remember a lot of stuff. He had a lot of physical pain. It was hard for him to get out of bed. So from a merciful point of view, it was good that he passed away. He really didn't have that much quality of life left. It was also, for me, it was significant. The day that he died was the first day of Passover.
Right.
Passover was a very spiritual time for us in our group.
Mm-hmm.
I saw that as a kind of a good sign from God, to be honest, that it was time for Jim to pass over to the other side, and that everything was okay. Now he's not having pain. He never renounced his belief system. He never publicly said he was sorry. In fact, he publicly would say, "I have nothing to be sorry about. I did what God wanted."
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So he never got to that point. He never owned up to anything.
No.
But the fact that he apologized to the few of us that were there in 2007, and we didn't need for him to get into details of what he was apologizing for. He just said, "I'm sorry for how things turned out."
Yeah, yeah.
We appreciate that. We had grown past that by that point. Jim had 4 wives in his whole life, and something like 18 kids.
Wow.
And the sad part for Jim is most of his children ended up not really wanting to be around him that much. They were upset with him over everything that he did.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I felt bad for him on that. He wasn't able to have the good family get together after prison that I was able to have. His wives divorced. All of his wives ended up divorcing him. All 4 of them.
But from what you've said, like your belief system and approaches to everything were just different. And I can't imagine that he would have come forward and said to his children, like, love who you want to love and spend time with who you want to spend time with. Yeah. It doesn't bother me. Like, the approach that you had after you came out of prison, I can't imagine he had that same approach.
No. And for me, I'm more introspective than Jim ever was. So realizing that I had to take ownership, realizing that, I'm a very strong believer that all things work together for good, that all things, will turn out okay, and they have for me. So, it was difficult for me to, for the pride to get crushed to where I could talk about it without self-condemnation and self-judgment and fearing that what other people would think, because, no matter who I've talked to, everybody's understanding. I've never had anybody, say bad stuff to me after they hear my story.
And I think that's
Jim just never got to that point.
No, it doesn't sound that way.
Admitting that he was wrong,
And I'm sure that he spent a lot of the sentence that he had in prison angry at other people for things that they had done and not taking a lot of responsibility for himself, is kind of how I imagined he would have been. Obviously I didn't know him, but from just what you've said and the way that he tried to get himself out of that situation by putting you in his shoes, kind of gives me that kind of feeling. But what you just said there about not caring what people think is so important for people that are coming out of these high controlling groups and coercive movements, to be able to talk about it and not care what people think is so important. I think so many people hold back on talking about their experiences and having these kind of cathartic moments of speaking through and understanding everything that happened, because they're worried that people will think that they are easily manipulated or have a lower IQ, because how could somebody go from being a 24-year-old guy with a child and a pregnant wife to kind of, going into the adult store with the briefcase? Like how can that happen to somebody? But and I always say at the end of these types of interviews that you're obviously you've published 2 books. You're not on the lower IQ. You're not easily manipulated. There's been certain things that it sounds to me as that Jim has done over time, to wear the followers down and you're being brought these different pieces of doctrine that you've gone away and studied. And you said it took you 6 months before you kind of came around to the idea about the kind of the disbelief in the Jewish and the Hebrew side of things. So it's not like you jumped on board instantly with different people's theologies and things like that. You went away and did your own research and came to your own conclusions, which changed the way that things happened. But it's so important that people can take away from this conversation that it's okay to speak to people about things, and there won't be the judgment that you think there is. There won't be people sitting there thinking, oh, you're so stupid, you're so dumb, how could you let this happen to you? I would never join a cult. I would never be in a group like this. Because from what you've explained to us, everything happens so organically. It just happens. Yeah. And when you're living in those self-sealing systems, it just happens. And if anything, coming away from that experience and talking about it and talking about it and talking about it in as many different ways as you can, on as many different platforms as you can find, has kind of brought you to this place where you can have these conversations and they don't have the effect on you that they used to have, which I think is really important for the listeners.
Yeah, sometimes it still hits me. I don't know that you can ever escape your past totally.
No.
It's still, when I talk about the gay church, it can get emotional for me. When I talk, just for me, it's how close I came to losing everything.
Absolutely,
I could have easily lost my wife, my kids, my life. And now I got grandchildren that call me Papa. So, when I'm around my grandkids, it makes me even more aware of how important it was that I didn't do the stuff I could have done.
Absolutely, yeah. And we wouldn't be sitting here today having this conversation if things had gone differently. Right. So, I'm really thankful and really grateful for your time today. And I just appreciate you coming here and telling me your story and putting it out into the world for more listeners to access who may not have heard this story before. And for them to now have access to your published titles if they hadn't heard of them before, because more resources are obviously really important in this field. So thank you so much for your time today, Kerry. I really appreciate it, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Can I ask one more question?
Absolutely.
Do you know what sex your child is?
Yes, she's a girl. She's going to be a girl born in June.
So you got a boy and a girl?
Yes.
Right? Good for you. Congratulations on that.
Thank you so much.
As somebody with 6 kids, one piece of advice.
Yes.
And I know you already know this. Make all the memories you can with your kids.
Oh, absolutely.
Everyone. Make memories. Kids remember memories more than anything else. And all the good memories that you can do makes them that much straighter.
That's my present. That will be my promise to you as I leave the call today. I'm going to go upstairs and I'm going to give my little boy a kiss goodnight, and then I'm going to go to bed and just appreciate all the kicking around I can feel in my belly at the moment before my little lady is born in a few months' time. So thank you so much, Kerry. I appreciate that. And you take it easy and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, please do so by emailing me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.